Welcome to the Afropolitan Podcast, hosted by Eche, Emole, founder of Afropolitan. On the show, we chat with Afropolitans whose footprints form the foundation of systems dedicated to building the future of a bold and progressive Black community. In each episode, our guests share their working formulas, the hard facts about leaving familiar terrain, embracing the unknown, and staying relevant afterwards. Listen as we extract the blueprints of fearlessness, innovation, and progress.
Hey Afropolitans! In today's episode, we chat with Elizabeth Yin, co-founder and general partner at Hustle Fund, a venture firm that invests in early-stage startups. Elizabeth talks about her journey to becoming a VC and advises startups entering the beer market. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Elizabeth, we're excited to have you on the Afropolitan Podcast. How are you doing and how are you feeling?
Thank you, Eche. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. Doing okay. Caught COVID recently, but doing good. Thank you.
Thank you so much for stopping by. I hope you're also, feeling much, much better.
Thank you. I am.
So, Elizabeth, can you talk us through your journey to becoming general partner at Hustle Fund?
Yeah, I never really envisioned becoming a VC, whether it's working at another VC or even starting my own VC. But I think the long and the short of it is I grew up in Silicon Valley during the dot-com boom. So even though my parents were not engineers or in tech or anything, or certainly didn't have a startup, the influence of this area had a big impact on me. And so growing up, I knew that I wanted to start a company when I grew up. And so fast forward, I studied engineering in college, went to work at big tech companies for a while, and then started my own company, which was an advertising tech business with my best friend from high school many years after college graduation. So in my late 20s or so. And we grew out that business, LaunchBit, for over the course of 6 or 7 years. And then we had a relatively modest exit to a much larger ad tech company on the East Coast. And that was really when I started thinking about sort of the other side of the fence, if you will. Not so much investing, but initially it was, helping other founders avoid some of the pitfalls that I had gone through in just learning through School of Hard Knocks with my startup. But eventually then doing a fair bit of angel investing, and also I ended up joining the 500 Startups Accelerator team, where I was a partner there for almost 3 years. And I ran that. And it was through that I started learning about investing. And I think, more specifically, I realized that, funding is a big problem for so many founders. But more than funding, there's this gap in knowledge and networks as well, which in many cases is equally as important, because a lot of information around how to do things had been behind closed doors for a long time. So we set out to start Hustle Fund almost 5 years ago to really address these three things: capital, knowledge, and networks. So I actually see myself less as a VC. Certainly deploying capital into startups is the bulk of what I do, but more holistically, we really want to really make startup ecosystems more vibrant, teach more founders about, these three things to really elevate startup ecosystems as a whole. That would be a big win for me in my career if we could do that.
That's honestly amazing to hear. But what would you say were some of the misconceptions you had about being a VC from the founder side that maybe you now have a better understanding of now that you're also on the other side of the table?
So many. I didn't understand how VCs made money. I didn't understand what kind of model or economics they were looking for. And I think on this side of the fence, it actually wasn't until I became a VC that I felt like I understood that a lot better. So I think number one, there is this misconception that I certainly had, which is if you're a good company and growing your revenues and all, you should be able to get capital. But the thing is, that's not how VCs look at things. Because of how the VC model is, where if you assume, they invest in 10 companies and 9 of them fail, it means they're really counting on their one winner or so to make up for all the failures plus much more. And when you work out the math on that, there's then a lot of pressure on that one company to really work out. And it's got to work out to the tune of what I would say 100x multiple. Meaning if I'm investing at, let's say, into a company with, let's say, a $5 million valuation, I'm hoping for at least a $500 million exit. A $50 million exit would not be sufficient in this model. And I know people are playing around with other models of, well, what if you could decrease failure and all of this? But I think, to date, no one has been successful at it.
What would you say, in your experience, has been one of the most successful exits? Because this is also a very important question, because as a founder, you also do need to self-assess, like, am I also VC backable? Is the industry or is the market I'm playing in the one that can lead to a 10x exit or a 15x exit? Or am I maybe playing in a smaller pond? So what would you say as an example of like the exit that goes from the investment to like maybe the 10x or 15x that you're most fond of?
Well, I think for us at Hustle Fund, we're still too new, because I think we're not just looking for 10x, we're looking for 100x. So that just takes years to build. But I can give you a couple of examples from the 500 startups portfolio, some of the companies that went through my batches. So there's a company in Canada called Majuri, and Majuri is like essentially a jewelry company. They do, not so personalized, but they do hot, trendy jewelry. And they have just really knocked it out of the park. Like, I guess when you think about, when 500 startups invested in where they're valued today, like that would be considered a great success. Another company is the Pill Club, which also we invested in at 500 startups, which is birth control delivered in the US, and similar scenario there. So those are examples, I think, of companies that haven't even gone IPO yet that are at that level. But you're talking about companies that are doing, 100 million in revenue a year or potentially more is really what we're talking about.
So I know a lot of founders obviously get frustrated through the fundraising process. You've been a founder, but now you're also a VC, and you also have to raise from LPs. Can you talk us through maybe the different nuances involved from the founder aspect of raising for funds from an investor and then being the investor who's raising for funds from LPs?
Yeah, I've been through both fundraising processes, and I think actually the founder fundraising process, as terrible as it sounds, is the easier one. But that being said, because when I was a founder and I'm raising money for the first time ever, just in general, I didn't know what I was doing, so it was very hard. And I couldn't raise any money when I first started fundraising for LaunchBit back in 2010 or 20, and that was even 2 years into my journey, a year and a half. And so and it's because I had no idea what I was doing. And so basically what we're saying here is, whether you're a founder or VC, number one, you have to paint a picture of how this can be a blockbuster success. So not just doubling an investor's money or tripling an investor's money, or even for early stage founders, 10x founder's money, an investor's money. You have to paint the picture of how does this get to be like 100 million a year business? That's thought number one. And then, for VC, similarly, how can this be like, I don't know, a 10x fund, which is like near impossible. Most funds are not 10x funds. Most funds historically that have been good have been closer to 2 or 3x. But you have to paint the picture of how can this be a huge, huge fund. And I think the second thing both people have to do, whether you're a founder or fund pitching, is you have to paint how you are differentiated from everyone out there. And that's what I really didn't understand as a founder. We were an ad tech business, and we were fairly unique in how we did our ad tech. But that didn't matter. Like, investors saw us as, oh, well, there's ad tech everywhere, right? There's Google ads, there's Facebook ads. Everybody and their mother has an ad network. That was not differentiated enough. So you have to really think about crazy, crazy differentiated ideas. I would actually say Afropolitan is highly differentiated. As an example, right? Yeah. So that's the kind of stuff that investors are interested in. And certainly on the fund side, it is way harder to differentiate yourself. You and the 1,000 other funds who are pitching, you all are doing the same thing, which is investing money and hopefully doing well. So how do you really paint a story that is unique? And in this day and age, as a fund manager, that's actually really hard. Even if you have specialty funds going after particular industries or demographics or geographies or whatever, like there are usually a handful of other funds doing the same thing at least. And so how do you really tighten that story to make it super unique?
Honestly, I think this is such an interesting perspective to look at it from, because like you said, the LPs are probably getting pitched by a gazillion other like fund managers, right? And so it's like it's much harder to find that unique proposition from a fund manager perspective. I think what I wanted to transition to is a lot of founders struggle with like retaining and recruiting talent, right? What advice would you give to like maybe even first-time founders who are looking to launch their startups to think through the recruiting of talent as well as the retaining of talent long-term?
Yeah, and this is something we certainly struggled with as well. Hiring is so hard. You know, maybe you can hire a friend here or a friend there, but it's not very scalable. I'd say it's really important for every startup or even fund to think about what is your mission? What is it that you are trying to do beyond make money? Like what is the broader, higher, goal that is beyond you? And that is what really helps to attract and retain talent. For an ad tech company like mine, that was really challenging, right? There's no great mission with advertising, so sometimes you have to get creative. I think a company that does this really well or used to do this really well is a company called Zappos, which you all know is a shoe company. It's really hard to get people excited about shoes per se, but the way that they frame it is they're so customer centric and it's all about customer happiness. That's the thing that they latched onto, even though they're a shoe company. And that's how they see their mission. So I think even if you are in a business where, okay, it's not sexy, it's like some sales CRM or something, and people don't get, passionate about CRMs, there's always something in the business that you can find that is part of your larger mission or vision that you can use as a selling point. That's why people go to work. Obviously, they have to pay the bills, but that's why people stay.
Yeah, definitely. And I think some people say like hire fast and then fire faster. Is that like a principle or a mindset that you think founders should also embrace?
Yes and no. So I am very bad at hiring. I've realized this over the years. I don't think I've gotten better at hiring. And I think when you think about a traditional hiring process, it's just really hard. You interview people and then you just don't know how it's going to turn out until they start working with you. So my approach, as I learned through hard lessons at LaunchBit, was try to do actually a project with somebody on a small project. They could even still be working at their current employer. And by working together, and you'll pay that person for that project, almost like a consultant kind of relationship, but just see what is it like to actually work with that person. And I think on the flip side, the way I would sell it to a candidate is they get to learn what it's like to work with you before they make the leap, right? So I actually think that's a great way to hire. On the firing side, in the beginning, I was terrible at it. I even asked my colleague at LaunchBit to do the firing for me because I just couldn't. But I think the first firing is hard, but after that, it gets a tinge easier because it's all business. But yes, first-time founders tend to fire too slowly.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, when you think through, what advice would you have for aspiring venture capitalists who want to come into the market? What should they be thinking through before they step in?
I think there are basically two paths to becoming a VC. One is joining an existing firm, and the other is starting your own. People often conflate the two, but they are very different. I actually think starting your own firm is much more akin to starting a venture-backed business. When you're joining someone else's firm, it's more akin to you're getting employed at Google. So in terms of the two paths, I don't have great advice on joining someone else's firm since I've never done it. But I think a high-level piece of advice, at least from being on this side, is you notice the people who send you deals. So if you want to get into the business, the number one thing to be a great VC is to pick great companies. The best way to get a job in VC at someone else's firm is to show and demonstrate that you have great deal flow. So if you do have that, or even if you don't have that, I would start, going out there and meeting startups and then just brokering intros to VCs. You can even cold email a VC and say, hey, I have great deal flow. If you're open to it, I would love to share it with you just by email.
Yeah.
And every VC will say yes to that. And then you do that. And then if it seems like, VCs are taking your intros, you're on the right track. And then it makes it easier then to, parlay that into a conversation with a VC about, hey, does it make sense to, take the next step and work together formally? That, I think, is what I would do if I were trying to work at someone else's firm. Starting your own firm, you have to know that you really want to start your own firm. And you have to have really solid reasons why you want to, because it is a tough road, especially on the fundraising side. The fundraise is way harder, like I said, in my opinion, than raising money for a startup. First of all, you have to raise way more money just to even make a dent in the world, right? Like your typical founder might raise, I don't know, $500,000 even goes a long ways, but a $500,000 fund does not go a long ways. So, I think people really struggle. Even the richest people I know who have funds, they really struggle to raise, because differentiating yourself as a fund who is not established with this brand is really hard.
I know Hustle Fund has raised $45 million across 2 funds, right? How was the fundraising process for you across those rounds? And how did you identify the LPs who you wanted to bring on board?
Yeah, for Fund 1, which was an $11.5 million fund, we did over 700 meetings. So that just gives you a sense of you have to really want it. And I would actually say I feel fortunate that our process, in my opinion, was relatively fast. We did it in 9 months. We really packed in the meetings. But, like my friend Matt Conwell, who runs Rare Breed Ventures, I think he tracked his raise for his Fund 1, and it was something like 1,100 meetings. Don't quote me on that, but something on that order of, in the thousands. So you have to really, really want to meet with a lot of people to pitch. I guess the good news is you get better at pitching as you go along, but that's thought number 1. We just met with a lot of people. And thought number 2 is we pitch anybody and everybody. Of course, we pitch people closest to us first, but although I would say we have a pretty good network, it's not like I'm friends with, tons of billionaires. So that only goes you so far. And I would say that we got to maybe about 2 or 3 million that way. So to cover the rest of the 8 million or so, it meant we were pitching people who didn't know us. They may be friends of friends, but friends of friends still have no loyalty to you. So it's just a numbers game. You are just pitching all the time. I pitch my eye doctor even, at my appointment, right? You take every opportunity to pitch. You go to the dentist as best as you can. You try to pitch with their tools in your mouth. That's what you're doing. You go to parties. Like if you're at NFT New York this week, you are pitching everybody, right? So yes. I think when people say they have no network to raise, I get that. And that needs to be better. But I also think even beyond network, you have to put yourself out there and go everywhere where there's anybody and everybody. The thing that surprised me the most was that there were people whom I pitched, not even expecting anything to come out of it because I didn't think they were that rich or could commit. But everybody knows somebody, right? It's funny because I talked with actually a number of my founders whom I backed at 500 startups. And, many of them, they don't have a lot of money in their startups, but they certainly know a lot of investors from having pitched their own startups, right? Or they have friends who know investors. So this world is just so small. The more you pitch, the more you'll get to those pools of money.
Definitely. And speaking about pitching, the first time I pitched you for Afropolitan and compared to now when I pitch, it is literally night and day. The first time I was pitching you, I was new to this. I was I don't know if Elizabeth is going to really get what we're doing. I was nervous, right? And I felt like I found my voice across, like you said, pitching multiple people. And I would say maybe about a month later, I was shocked when I could just, give the pitch in a very strong way, tell the story. And I was like, wow, you just got to keep practicing this, right? And you get better with the story that you're telling, and the bass in your voice gets more confident, So
Totally.
I wanted to thank you for that. Yeah, because you definitely did not get the Eche pitch of today. You got the fresh Eche pitch for sure.
Yeah, no, totally. Pitches refine pretty quickly just with practice. And like you said, but the other thing it does is, people give you little bits of feedback, even if they don't commit along the way. They'll say something like a little thing in passing, like, oh, I didn't get conviction because of X or whatever it is. And even if they're wrong or they didn't understand correctly, you then realize, well, maybe I should change the wording slightly. So even if the pitch doesn't change that much, but it generally does, like even the nuances of the specific words you use do tend to change. And certainly the confidence is a huge, huge thing. Investors need to hear your confidence to be confident. So, yeah.
I know there was a lot of liquidity in the ecosystem of the last few years, right? What were your thoughts around some of the sky-high valuations that a lot of startups were receiving from other VCs?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I think, first off, I think the market has always been fairly bifurcated, and certainly is in this context as well, in that, yes, we did read a lot of articles on TechCrunch about how these companies were now unicorns but had no revenue or whatever. But I would say, at least for the vast majority of my portfolio, that was not the case. And for most startups out there, not everybody benefited from the sky-high valuations. So that's thought number one. But I think thought number two, what I do see as a change in this market is it is much harder for everybody to raise money, in that it's slower. Investors are moving more slowly. So even if the valuations have come down for a subset, but remain the same for everyone else, it is still slower for everybody. And so that's sort of been a change, I think.
Yeah, definitely. But what are your thoughts now about, at least what is your advice for startups now, maybe coming into the bear market, and how to think through maybe runway, maybe extending that runway as well? What do you think the market potentially holds for the next couple of years, really?
Yeah, it's so hard to predict. But I mean, I think, I started my company during the last recession in late 2008, early 2009. Obviously couldn't raise any money. We couldn't even raise 25K. So I think everyone just needs to adjust expectations. Even though everyone has a different definition of pre-seed investing, and we call ourselves pre-seed investors, my old-fashioned impression of a pre-seed round is under $500,000. I think over the years that has ballooned, and people call anything under 5 million a pre-seed round, which I think now we're just going back to fundamentals. All right, how much do you actually need to get some bare bones thing out the door? Everything that's a nice to have goes out the window. You really don't need like a large team for most software businesses at the pre-seed stage. I think, in the last couple of years, we've just seen people perhaps hire too many people in the beginning, spend too much money. I think this market favors people who are savvier and more frugal. And then it comes back to fundamentals on the other side as well. Like, how do you make money right away or as quickly as possible? Can you pre-sell your product even if it's not ready? Can you sell tickets to events to cultivate an audience and then parlay them into customers? Things like that. Like, how can you be more revenue oriented? And that's, I think, the founders who can do sort of those two things, will really actually benefit in this market.
Definitely. Did you have any VCs in the space who had a major influence on your growth?
I really credit Charles Hudson for helping me with initial early advice when I was leaving 500 startups and starting Hustle Fund. Charles's fund, Precursor Ventures, is probably a fund ahead of ours. So, he really knew what it was like to go through the gauntlet of raising from LPs and for a pre-seed fund, which frankly speaking, pre-seed is a common term now, which may not make any sense because seed was always early in the beginning. But, back then, there were really no pre-seed funds. He pretty much pioneered the space. And so he helped me with some initial tactics on how do you actually start raising such a fund. So I think at a higher level, like I read a lot about different VC strategies and, have been impressed by obviously so many of the older funds that have done a good job with what I would say legacy. So like Sequoia, for example, they're looking at a different set of problems. Fundraising super easy for them, but to sustain a great fund over the decades is pretty amazing. And that comes from like, how do you think about your succession planning in bringing in the next set of investors and handing the reins over to them and making sure they're constantly, knocking it out of the park. To do that for decades is impressive.
Very, definitely. And I think it's always underrated, right? Like people just don't realize how hard it is to maintain that level of sustainability over multiple funds into the decades. Elizabeth, everyone gets to deal with failure at some point. What would you say was your most significant encounter with failure, and what lessons did it teach you?
I've had so many failures, Eche, and especially within LaunchBit. But I think the one that really stands out to me is what I would call failure that I would categorize as a people failure, in that, I started LaunchBit with my best friend from high school. And, as some of you who may be founders can relate to this, like, starting a company is a lot of pressure. You can easily get into a lot of disagreements with your co-founder. There can be a lot of strain between co-founders, regardless of whether you were friends before or not. But in particular, if you start a business with a close friend or something like that, it can really take a huge strain. An extreme example is I've seen married couples who founded a company together get a divorce, and I've seen friendships broken up. And I would say for me, LaunchBit really did take a toll on my friendship with my co-founder as well. And so I blame myself. Obviously, I couldn't foresee that happening, but I think, in retrospect, I don't know, would I have started a business with such a close friend? I'm not sure.
Honestly, I think this is something I would even love to explore more. So when you then think through the lessons from that, do you say to yourself, okay, in the future, I won't start businesses with a friend? Or do you say maybe it just didn't work out in this particular situation and maybe the next situation can be different?
Well, it's interesting. I can kind of compare because I started Hustle Fund with also two friends of mine, but there were a couple of differences. Actually, I started Hustle Fund originally with just one friend of mine, Eric Bond, and we actually talked about this point, very point blank, because he had experienced something similar with his startup before. And so I think, going into this the second time around with eyes wide open, everybody also having the same perspective, I think it's easier for us to handle friendships and business now as a second time founder, having dealt with this particular thing. The second thing is, I think friendships are great in that you already have strong trust with your partners, but I think there's also got to be separation between the friendship and the business. And with both of my business partners, we do have good separation between the friendship and the business. And I think that's just not what I managed well before with my startup. So I think I wouldn't say never start a business with your friend, but I think those are kind of the two things that at least I have top of mind now.
I would say, at least in my experience, what I've learned is you have to be able to maybe compartmentalize a little bit, where you evaluate your friend from like a competence and skill level versus, hey, you're my friend, it'll be great to jump into a business to be together, which is what you do in the early stages, right? But after, when you're like, hey, you need a solid team member here who actually can execute. And then that maybe leads to a deeper respect, because you know that outside of your partnership, they're an operator in their own right. So
yeah, totally. And I think also understanding how to have disagreements is also really important. I think sometimes disagreements can feel personal, even if it's around a business aspect. So that was sort of, I think, another thing that at least I had to learn. I mean, it's not like my co-founder and I were disrespectful. We were never like, you're stupid or anything like that. But I think sometimes when you have so many disagreements over the days, the weeks, the years, it starts to take a bit of a toll. And so like learning how to, solve those disagreements and having a sort of framework for that is really important even from the outset.
Definitely. Elizabeth, what would you say was your introduction into crypto or Web3? And why does it speak to you?
Well, I think many years ago, actually, my husband read an article in the newspaper or on some online news site about Bitcoin. This is like in 2011 or 2012 even. And he was like, oh, we should, buy $1 of this. And I was like, this is stupid. So I guess that was the initial intro. God. I still listen to him, even though we may have lost everything in Mt. Gox, that situation. But, I think years later I would say 2017, a lot of my friends got into crypto. And I think it was just sort of in hearing bits and pieces from friends about, what they were doing. Most of them were just speculating, honestly. They were flipping, getting 2 or 3x from flips, the tokens that they would buy in some pre-sale and then sell it at the ICO. But I think cutting through away some of that noise, I was very intrigued by some of the projects, or at least the ideals of some of the projects. And that was really what got me excited. I'm not a speculator. I'm not a flipper. Anytime I've tried to do that, I've done that poorly and lost money. So I'm more in it for like some of the intellectual thought of like, well, what if people didn't run things and the system ran things? That's interesting to me conceptually. And I think the other interesting thing is like, how can you get more people involved in funding projects? I think right now, for better or worse, the SEC is, highly regulates how things get invested in. And I think while on one hand, it's important to have regulation, on the other hand, I think there are a lot of cool projects that just traditional investors won't get behind for all the reasons we talked about before. So how can we make the world a better place by getting more interesting projects that consumers will use funded? And you can potentially do that through retail. So those are the two things that I like about crypto.
And I know you guys also launched Hustleverse. Could you talk us through the initiative that Hustleverse has?
Yeah, so we have a couple of crypto initiatives right now at Hustle Fund that we launched internally with our own team. And in part, we did that because we really believe, actually, that crypto is just at the beginning, but there's certain infrastructure that we think needs to be better, and that isn't necessarily venture backable, that we could just sort of help with ourselves. So the first is we have a project called Hustleverse, which is essentially a member-based community to help teach people about Web3. So it's like an education platform, if you will. Like we talk about different topics at a very beginner level, because I think right now, in general, crypto is so complex. People talk about all these tools under the assumption you already know everything. And so we're like, all right, let's just rewind the clock and we'll teach everything as if everyone's 5. And then also have tactical exercises where people can actually try doing things like set up a wallet, send crypto, how do you create a token gated website, things like that. So that's Hustleverse. And then we also have another initiative called Crypto Shift. And Crypto Shift actually came about because a lot of our crypto companies needed more help in kind of figuring out product market fit, if you will, and getting user feedback. So what Crypto Shift is we work with people who want to try new crypto projects, like crypto enthusiasts, and pay them. And then on the other side, we have our portfolio companies and other crypto companies who want more feedback on, how can they make their product better, et cetera. In many ways, it's a little bit like some of those user testing tools for Web 2.
And I know there seems to be a lot of BS sometimes in the Web3 space. What would you say are some of the downsides that you're seeing or observed in this space that you're like, okay, we need to get rid of that?
In crypto, I think the problem is everything is just so hard to use, so that that precludes a lot of people from using it. I would say even setting up a wallet is not an easy thing for most people. And then the other thing is around regulations, like spinning up your own cryptocurrency, is obviously really hard. There are a lot of hoops you have to jump through, and therefore it's also expensive. So that's another thing. I think those two things need to get way, way, way better before crypto becomes like an actual thing and not just a speculative industry.
Definitely. So, Elizabeth, if the only thing left in the world was to read a book about your life, what would the title of the book be?
This is the boringest book you'll ever read. No, I think, well, my hope by the time I'm dead would be that book says something like, she helped millions of startups. I think that's what I would hope the title would be. But I'm not there.
I love that. But are there any 3 books that have had a profound impact on your life?
Oh, wow. I read a lot and listen to a lot of audiobooks, and there are so many great ones out there. I think for startups, the 3 that I would pick are, okay, so one of them is Lean Startup by Eric Ries. Predictable Revenue by Aaron Ross is the second book, and it's basically about how you can run like a repeatable sales process. And it's very tactical and very good. So those are my top 2 for startups.
And then one more, personal, maybe?
Oh, gosh. Maybe one more for startups, I would say, just for fun, is Shoe Dog. It's the story of Nike. And the reason I like it, it's not tactical, but it's very inspirational on a number of levels. Number one, it's set during a time when there's pretty much no financing. So how do you build a shoe company that has such huge capital costs? They can't get a loan. There's no venture capital. They can't go IPO. Like, just everything is closed. And also, it's, one of the first times, I think, in history where you could say that it was like successful, or at least well-known, successful import-export. So it's, he talks about how he ended up with this idea to come up with these cool shoes, Nike shoes, based on shoe designs he saw in Japan on one of his trips there when he was kind of bumming around. So it's just very inspirational all around. Like, how do you get into the shoe business? How do you make this work without any money? All the points when they almost failed, but someone pulled through. Like, it's incredibly inspirational, especially if you're going through hard times as a founder, which I often did with Launchbit. That is a book you want to read during those hard times.
Definitely. And Elizabeth, as an investor in Afropolitan, what would you say that being Afropolitan means to you?
Yeah. I think what I love about Afropolitan is it's a new take on what I would call geography and culture. I'll just take a step back and then I'll come back to your question. Like, when you think about sort of the world over the centuries, like, a lot of it has been very geographically siloed. And for good reason. There wasn't really transportation and there wasn't the internet and all that. And so it was like cultures formed in these particular areas. But over time, fast forward to where we are now with the internet, and obviously people can travel anywhere and everywhere. It is really fascinating to me, even just through my own life, like pieces of culture in various places, being exchanged across geographies. In my own life growing up in, call it the 80s and 90s, like, around here, maybe you could go to Chinatown and you could get sort of those flip-flops. They were not common in a regular shoe store, but like the Asian flip-flops, you could only get that in Chinatown. Now, like, everybody and their mother has flip-flops, and there are various takes on flip-flops and all this. And so I guess what I'm saying, like, the exchange of ideas and culture, not just physical things, but also thoughts and ideas, is really interesting to me. And what I love about Afropolitan is, I would say that Africa is, probably at the beginning of what I would call its boom and heyday, both economically, but also culturally. And so I think there's a real opportunity to essentially bring, and I say African culture loosely because I fully realize there are many countries in Africa, but like to the rest of the world, and to really incorporate that in other people's lives who may never have been to Africa or whatnot. And so I just think there is that opportunity to really create sort of more of a melting pot in various places in the world.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It has been a pleasure having you on the Afropolitan Podcast. Thank you for giving us your time, Elizabeth, and I hope you've had a great time as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Eche. This has been fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Afropolitan Podcast. We are building the future of a progressive Black community. To join our community, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Afropolitan. Be sure to join our Discord and Clubhouse community by clicking on the link tree on our Instagram page. See you on social.